The laminated card had been printed in a font so small that Owen had needed to hold it at two different distances before committing to a third, which suggested either that the palace's administrative department had strong opinions about minimalism, or that they simply did not expect the people receiving these cards to read them very carefully. He read it very carefully: surface maintenance, linen rotation, environmental calibration, see secondary manual. There was a secondary manual. It was 340 pages long and had been published in a year that preceded, by some margin, the atmospheric processor currently humming at a frequency just below awareness in the corner of the royal residential chamber. The palace was the kind of place that had been designed by someone with unlimited resources and very specific feelings about ceilings. Owen had passed through 4 of them on the way to this room: ceilings, not people, though he had passed through several people as well, all of whom moved with the coordinated efficiency of individuals who had long ago made peace with being background elements in someone else's life. He had been issued a uniform, a keycard, and a look from the staffing coordinator that communicated, without words, that he was expected to perform his functions without requiring the palace to notice him doing so. Queen Sophia had not looked up when he entered. She was at her desk, a piece of furniture so aggressively understated that it had almost certainly cost more than Owen's transport fee from the outer residential district, reading something on a document screen that she angled very slightly away from the door when it opened. Not suspiciously, with the automatic, practiced reflex of someone who has spent a long time in rooms where other people are always arriving. Her ears, long and gently tapered, caught the room's recycled light at an angle that made them look carved. Her expression had the composed, interior quality of someone solving a problem that she found adequately interesting. He located the supply console, confirmed it matched the diagram on page 7 of the secondary manual, and began. The atmospheric processor in the corner cycled through what the manual described as its ambient optimization sequence *, which produced, for approximately 40 seconds, a sound strongly reminiscent of someone attempting to open a very old jar in an adjacent room. Owen did not react to this. Sophia did not react to this. They had both, it appeared, arrived at the same professional conclusion about the sound, though by different roads. He worked across the room in the order the laminated card specified, which had the benefit of being logical, and the drawback of eventually bringing him to the section of wall paneling directly adjacent to her desk. He approached this section with the focused neutrality of someone diffusing something. She did not look up. He began the work, arms extended, attention on the upper corner where the panel met the ceiling in a join that someone had installed with great precision, and someone else had subsequently allowed to collect the specific gray residue that accumulates in places that are nobody's direct responsibility. At some point, he became aware that she had stopped reading. He did not look down to confirm this. He was professional. He was also operating from the reasonable position that a queen who wished to communicate something would communicate it, and that proceeding as though she had not stopped reading was, in the absence of instruction, the correct approach. The atmospheric processor completed its optimization sequence and settled into a low, self-satisfied hum. Somewhere in the corridor outside, something wheeled past the door, paused, and then continued, a sound he would later attribute correctly to Unit 7, though he did not yet know that Unit 7 existed, or that Unit 7 had already formed what could only be described as an opinion about him. Sophia's document screen had gone to its rest state. The room was very quiet in the particular way of rooms that are very well insulated against a city that is, just beyond their walls, producing an enormous amount of noise. Owen reached across to complete the final section. Her hands found his before he had completed the motion. Not as a correction, his angle had been correct, the manual had been consulted, the technique was sound. Not as a command, which would have carried a different pressure entirely, the kind of pressure that knows it will be obeyed and factors this into the gesture. What her hands carried was something more deliberate than either of those things, the quality of an action that has been considered from multiple directions over a period of time, and is now being completed with the care of someone who does not intend to repeat it. Her fingers closed around his with a gentleness that had, underneath it, the specific firmness of certainty. Owen went still. This was not covered in the secondary manual. He had checked, not in anticipation of this particular situation, but because he was the kind of person who read secondary manuals, and he was reasonably confident that 340 pages had not contained a relevant protocol. He remained as he was, arms extended, one hand against the panel and one hand now held by a queen who was looking at it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reading a document they have been waiting some time to receive. She was looking at his hands, not at his face, which he found in some analytical part of himself that was apparently still functioning, interesting. She examined the calluses along his fingers, the particular wear across his palm, the way the skin had thickened and shifted over years of specific labor in ways that a person's hands will do when they have been used consistently, and without much ceremony. She turned his hand slightly. He allowed this without quite deciding to, and looked at the inside of his wrist with the expression of someone confirming a thing rather than discovering it. The atmospheric processor offered no comment. It had settled into its low, contented hum and appeared to consider its responsibilities discharged. When she looked up, her expression had the quality of someone who has finished reading and arrived at the conclusion the document was always going to deliver. Her ears had angled forward, very slightly, in the way he had noticed they did when something warranted closer attention. She did not release his hand. Outside in the corridor, Unit 7 had stopped moving entirely. Owen would later learn that Unit 7 possessed a proximity sensor, sophisticated enough to distinguish between routine room activity, and what the unit's internal classification system had apparently decided to log as asterisk situation. Non-standard asterisk, a category it had created independently and without authorization sometime in the previous calendar year. Unit 7 had opinions about many things. It kept most of them in a private log that it had password protected against the maintenance team, using a code derived from what appeared to be an obscure agricultural regulation from 3 systems over. The maintenance team had thus far chosen not to interrogate this too closely, on the reasonable grounds that Unit 7's work was excellent, and some things are better left as they are. Sophia said, "You worked the northern excavation on Karen IV." It was not a question. It arrived in the room with the weight of a statement that has been held for some time, and the particular shape of something spoken aloud after considerable internal debate about whether to speak it at all. Owen looked at her. "For 2 years," he said. "Yes." She nodded, with the economy of someone for whom the confirmation had been necessary but the surprise had not. Her thumb moved once across the back of his hand, not unconsciously, nothing about her suggested unconscious movement, and then she released him. She settled back in her chair with the composed deliberateness of someone concluding one thing and considering how to begin the next. He lowered his arm. His hand remembered the shape of the contact the way hands do, holding the ghost of a pressure after the pressure has gone. "The staffing shortage," she said, after a moment that had the quality of a paragraph break, "was not accidental." Owen considered this. He looked at the document screen, which had moved from its rest state back to active at some point in the last 30 seconds, suggesting she had resumed or was preparing to resume whatever she had been working on before he had entered the room, before the final panel, before any of this. He looked at the atmospheric processor. He looked at the laminated card which was in his breast pocket and which had been printed, he now suspected, in a font that small entirely on purpose. "The conference," he said, "is real," she said. The scheduling was deliberate. A pause. The form required a reason. We used asterisk staffing shortage. It was the most accurate option available. He stood in the middle of the royal residential chamber holding a laminated card that had sent him, by a route he was only now beginning to map, from the outer residential district to this room, to this panel, to this specific moment. The ceiling was very high. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the corridor, Unit 7 made the small, satisfied sound of a machine that has correctly anticipated a situation and logged it under the right category. He did not ask the obvious question immediately. This was partly because he was not someone who reached for obvious questions the way others reached for the nearest available handhold, and partly because the obvious question had approximately 17 sub-questions attached to it, and he preferred to know which one he actually wanted answered before opening that particular door. He finished the panel instead. This was, he recognized, an unusual response to being told that one's entire professional assignment had been architecturally constructed around one's presence. Sophia watched him do it with an expression that contained, if he was reading it correctly, a small quantity of something that was not quite amusement but occupied the same neighborhood. He worked with the same focused attention he had brought to every other surface in the room, because the panel still needed finishing, and he was not going to do it badly simply because the context had shifted dramatically. The atmospheric processor hummed. The ceiling remained very high. He completed the section, confirmed it against the standard the manual specified, and returned his materials to the supply console with the methodical care of someone who does not leave things unfinished regardless of circumstances. Then he turned around. "How long," he said, "has my file been on your desk?" She did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. She looked at him with the evaluating attention she had brought to his hands, applied now to his face, as though checking whether the question had been asked in the spirit she had assessed it would be asked in. Apparently satisfied, she said, "The excavation report from Karen IV was forwarded to my office 14 months ago. Your name appeared in the methodology section." A brief pause. 3 times. Owen absorbed this. 14 months was a considerable amount of time to appear in someone's methodology section. "I wrote the report," he said. "I know. The methodology section is usually the part people skip." "I know that too," she said, and something in her voice on the second sentence had a quality he couldn't immediately classify, dry and precise, and not entirely without warmth. He looked at the laminated card again without removing it from his pocket, which was a thing a person could do when they had read a document carefully enough. Surface maintenance, linen rotation, environmental calibration, see secondary manual. A document whose true contents, it now appeared, bore approximately no relationship to its listed functions. He felt a specific kind of retrospective attention settling over the last 3 days, the way light changes when the source of it shifts, everything the same, everything re-angled. The door to the corridor produced a small sound. Not a knock, the particular sound of a wheeled unit that has positioned itself adjacent to a door and is exercising what could generously be called patience. Owen looked at the door. Sophia looked at the door. The sound occurred again with a quality that suggested it was not going to stop occurring. "That will be Unit 7, Sophia said. "I gathered. It has been logging your movements since your first morning." She said this with the tone of someone conveying information they find mildly embarrassing on behalf of a third party. It generated a report. The report was 4 pages long. The maintenance team found it during a routine systems check and elected not to mention it to me directly, which means they mentioned it to everyone else. She paused. "The kitchen staff know your coffee preference. I don't know how." Owen thought about the terrible coffee in the break room, which Dara had handed him each morning with the expression of someone performing an act of mercy. He thought about the way Dara had asked, on the second day, questions that he had categorized at the time as friendly and was now recategorizing with some efficiency. He thought about the maintenance robot in the hallway, who had apparently been conducting a 4-page surveillance operation on his behalf and distributing the findings to the catering department. "The kitchen staff," he said carefully, "sent up good coffee this morning." "Yes," Sophia said. I thought that was a general improvement in service. It was a specific one. He looked at the door, behind which Unit 7 was demonstrating that machines, when they develop something resembling a personality, tend to develop all of it at once without much concern for proportion. He looked at Sophia, who had the expression of someone who has set a number of things in motion over 14 months and is now present at the point where they arrive. The room held the particular quality of a moment that is not the beginning of something, because the beginning had been a methodology section, and a report, and a name appearing 3 times in the kind of document that most people skip, but is the place where a beginning becomes visible to everyone involved. The obvious question, Owen said, has about 17 parts to it. I'm aware, she said. I've had 14 months to prepare for most of them. Outside, Unit 7 made a sound that the maintenance team would later describe in their own report as * operational contentment, a category they had also not previously needed, and added to the system documentation with the resigned acceptance of people who have stopped being surprised by Unit 7 and have not yet decided what to do about it. He asked the first part of the obvious question, not because it was the most important part. He had ranked them, internally, with the automatic precision of someone who has spent 2 years on an excavation site where the order in which you ask things determined the quality of what you found, but because it was the one that needed to come before any of the others could mean anything. What was in the methodology section, he said, that was worth 14 months. Sophia was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has prepared an answer, and is now deciding whether the prepared answer is the right one, or whether the moment calls for something less constructed. She appeared to reach a conclusion about this. She turned her document screen toward him. He crossed the room and looked at it. It was the Karen IV report. His own words, on a screen in the Royal Residential Chamber, rendered in the palace's document font, which was considerably more legible than the laminated card font, and suggested that the administrative department had a hierarchy of reading material they considered worth the effort. The methodology section was open. 3 passages were marked in the pale blue of a reader who has returned to something more than once. He read them not because he didn't know what they said, he had written them. He knew exactly what they said, but because reading them from this angle, marked in someone else's attention, made them into a slightly different document than the one he remembered producing. The first marked passage was about the excavation technique. Specifically, about a modification he had made to the standard approach on the 4th week, when the standard approach had begun producing results that were technically acceptable and substantively wrong. He had written about this with the directness of someone filing a report rather than making an argument, which had been, his supervisor at the time had noted with some displeasure, an interesting editorial choice. The second was about the site itself, what it had been before it was an excavation site, what the soil composition suggested about the duration and nature of occupation. He had included 3 paragraphs on this that were, strictly speaking, outside the report's stated scope, and had justified their inclusion in a footnote that his supervisor had also noted, with increasing displeasure, was longer than several of the official sections. The third marked passage was the last paragraph of the methodology section. It was 4 sentences long. It said, in the careful language of someone who has learned to say precise things in forms that will be read by people who prefer their precision contained, that the standard excavation protocols for sites of this classification had been developed for a different kind of looking, and were therefore finding a different kind of thing, and that the difference between what was being found and what was present was a question that the current methodology was structurally unable to ask. Owen looked at that paragraph for a moment, then he looked at Sophia. That paragraph, he said, was almost cut. I know, she said. Your supervisor's revision notes are attached to the original submission file. A pause. He described it as * editorializing beyond the document's functional purpose *. That's accurate. It's also, she said, the reason you're in this room. He straightened up. The document screen returned to her side of the desk, with the smooth, counterweighted motion of furniture that has been built to be used thoughtfully. He stood with his hands at his sides and processed the specific information that a four-sentence paragraph, which had survived its own near deletion by a margin he had not known about until this moment, had been read by a queen 14 months ago and had produced, through a chain of events that included a fabricated staffing shortage, a 340-page manual, and a surveillance robot with a password-protected personal log. This room, this conversation, this afternoon. There's a site, Sophia said. Not Karen IV. A different classification entirely. The current protocols don't have a category for it, which is part of the problem. She looked at him with the directness of someone who has arrived at the part of the conversation they have been navigating toward. The standard teams have been looking at it for 8 months. They are finding technically acceptable results. And substantively wrong ones, Owen said. The reports are very thorough, she said, with a precision that contained, underneath it, the full weight of her dissatisfaction with those reports and the professional restraint she was applying to the expression of it. They measure everything the methodology instructs them to measure. And the methodology, Owen said, is structurally unable to ask the right question. Yes, the atmospheric processor cycled through a brief recalibration, producing for several seconds the sound of the adjacent jar again, and then settled. Unit 7, in the corridor, had gone quiet in the manner of a machine that is listening, which was a thing machines were not supposed to do, and which Unit 7 had clearly not received the memo about. Owen looked at the window, through which the city was conducting its enormous noise at a remove that made it look from here like something peaceful and considered. 2 years on Karen IV. A methodology section. A paragraph that had almost not existed. He looked back at her. "When do we leave?" he said. It was not a question either. Something in Sophia's expression shifted, not dramatically. She was not a person who did things dramatically, but with the quality of attention that has been held for 14 months and has just, quietly and without ceremony, been set down. Her ears angled forward. "There are approximately 40 forms," she said. "The staffing office will need a reason. We used asterisk personnel reassignment in the draft, but the form requires a subcategory, and none of them quite apply." Owen thought about this. "Environmental calibration," he said. "See secondary manual." Sophia looked at him for a moment. Then, with the economy and the precision of someone who very rarely did it, she smiled. The 40 forms took 3 days. This was considered by the Palace Administrative Department an impressive turnaround. It was considered, by Owen, a reasonable explanation for why things in the known universe so frequently remained as they were. The forms had subsections. The subsections had their own subsections, which referenced other forms, which referenced the original forms in a self-sustaining loop of bureaucratic architecture that had clearly been designed by someone who believed that the prevention of action was itself a kind of governance. He filled them out at a small desk in a corridor anteroom that Unit 7 had begun visiting with the regularity of a scheduled appointment, arriving each morning with the mechanical equivalent of a collegial nod, and positioning itself at an angle that suggested it was available for consultation if required. Owen had not consulted it. Unit 7 had offered opinions anyway, in the form of small directional movements towards certain form sections that had, he eventually conceded to himself, been genuinely useful. He did not say this aloud. He was not ready to have that conversation with a machine that kept a password-protected personal log and had distributed his coffee preferences to the kitchen staff without being asked. Dara found him on the second day, in the way that Dara found most things, through a combination of institutional knowledge and the specific talent of someone who has worked in a large building long enough to know which corridors people use when they don't want to be found, and therefore exactly where to look for them. She sat down across from him without being invited, which was consistent with everything he had learned about Dara in 3 days, and looked at the stack of forms with the expression of someone regarding the aftermath of a natural disaster they had predicted and been ignored about. Personnel reassignment, she said, reading the top form. Subcategory, environmental calibration. She looked at him. The subcategory doesn't cover personnel. There's a secondary manual, Owen said. Dara stared at him for a moment. Then she picked up her terrible coffee. She had brought 2 cups, which he now understood was not generosity so much as intelligence gathering conducted through the medium of caffeine, and drank from it with the air of someone recalibrating. The secondary manual, she said, is for atmospheric systems. It's a broad document. It's 340 pages about filters. There's a section on environmental personnel interface, Owen said. Page 274. It's 3 sentences long and was clearly added by someone who needed a subcategory to not exist and solved the problem by making it technically exist. He paused. I respect the methodology. Dara looked at him for a long time. She had the expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces that had been delivered to her at intervals and were only now achieving sufficient density to form a coherent image. You're going with her, she said, to the site. There's a site. There's always a site, Dara said, with the weary authority of someone who has worked in the palace long enough to understand that the word site in this context carried the specific gravity of something that had been concerning people at a classification level above her own for a considerable period. She drank her coffee. Unit 7 has already filed a request to be included in the transport manifest. Owen looked up from the forms. It filed a request. 4 pages, very thorough. She paused. The maintenance team approved it before anyone thought to check whether they had the authority to approve transport manifests. And now, there's a separate form for that, which is also on your desk, and which I want you to know I had no part in generating, though I did tell them which desk was yours. He looked at the new form, which had appeared under the existing stack at some point, and which did, in fact, request the inclusion of 1 Unit 7 in the transport manifest on grounds described as operational continuity and site assessment support, a phrase that had no established meaning in the transport documentation and had been used with the confidence of something that expected this not to be investigated too closely. He signed it. He was not entirely sure why. He suspected it was because Unit 7 had, in the anteroom each morning, maintained a quality of presence that he could only describe as steady, the mechanical equivalent of someone sitting with you in a difficult task without making it about themselves. And he found that he did not want to examine his feelings about a surveillance robot too directly, because the examination would arrive somewhere he wasn't prepared to be. The 3rd day brought the final forms and a message from Sophia's office that was brief and contained no greeting, which he had come to understand was not curtness, but economy. She used words the way his excavation team had used equipment, precisely and without surplus. It said that departure was confirmed for the following morning, that the site's classification had been updated to include a new subcategory that her office had submitted to the relevant body 3 weeks ago, and which had been approved with a speed that suggested the relevant body had been waiting for someone to submit it, and that the transport had been arranged. It said one other thing. At the end, after the logistics, in the same spare and deliberate language as everything before it, 4 sentences, no more, in the manner of a methodology section that knows exactly what it is doing and has decided to do it anyway. He read those 4 sentences 3 times, at 2 different distances and then a third. Outside the anteroom, the city moved through its evening with the enormous indifference of cities, and the atmospheric processor somewhere above him completed its optimization cycle, and Unit 7 waited in the corridor with its steady, patient, entirely unauthorized presence, and Owen sat with the message on the screen in front of him and understood that the beginning, which had been a paragraph that almost didn't exist, had been building toward this room, this evening, this specific quality of quiet, for longer than either of them had said aloud. They left at dawn, which was a thing that departure schedules always said, and which almost never meant actual dawn, but this one did. The transport lifted from the palace platform in the precise window between dark and light, when the city below was neither one thing nor the other. Its enormous noise briefly softened into something that looked, from altitude, almost like intention. Owen watched it through the transport window until it became a pattern, and then an abstraction, and then nothing, replaced by the upper atmosphere's particular shade of deep and depthless blue. He had one bag. He had packed it the night before with the efficiency of someone who has learned, over 2 years on an excavation site in a system 4 transit days from anything resembling convenient, that the relationship between what you bring and what you need is best kept simple and honest. Unit 7 was in the cargo section. This had been a compromise. The original transport manifest, as approved by the maintenance team in their moment of unauthorized enthusiasm, had listed Unit 7 under Personnel Asterisk, which the transport coordinator had flagged with the expression of someone who has seen many things in this position, and had believed, until that moment, that they had achieved a comprehensive taxonomy. Unit 7 had been reclassified as Asterisk Specialist Equipment after a discussion that Owen had not been present for but had been briefed on by Dara, who had witnessed it and described it with the loving detail of someone who intended to tell this story for the rest of their professional life. Unit 7 had, during the reclassification process, produced its 4-page transport request document again. Unprompted, the transport coordinator had read all 4 pages. No one was entirely sure what had happened in the coordinator after that, but Unit 7 had been granted a cargo berth with what the manifest described as asterisk environmental monitoring equipment, and the coordinator had taken the rest of the afternoon. Sophia was working. She had been working since before Owen had boarded, her document screen angled with the same practiced reflex as always, her attention on whatever required it with the quality he had come to recognize as simply how she was, not closed, not distant, but present in a way that was entirely her own, and did not require the room to arrange itself around it. Her ears moved slightly when the transport broke through the upper atmosphere, and the sound changed. A small unconscious adjustment to new information, and she continued working. He had learned, in 3 days of forms and 1 anteroom, and 4 sentences at the end of a message, he had read at 2 distances and then a third, that this was not something he needed to interrupt. He had also learned that she was aware of him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, peripheral, precise, and not actually peripheral at all. He opened the secondary manual. This was, he recognized, an unusual thing to do on a transport leaving a planet. It was 340 pages about atmospheric filters, and 3 sentences on page 274 that had been inserted by someone solving a bureaucratic problem with a creativity he genuinely admired. He had flagged page 274. He had also, he discovered, flagged 7 other pages during the 3 days of forms, not because they were relevant to the forms, but because the manual had been written by at least 3 different people with 3 very different relationships to their material, and the places where those relationships showed through the technical language were, he found, unexpectedly interesting. He was on page 211 when Sophia said, without looking up, "You're reading the manual. There's a section on pressure differential calibration that was written by someone who was angry about something." She looked up at that. "Page 198, she said. He checked. "Page 198, you've read it." "I read everything in the residential service documentation when the assignment was being constructed." A pause. "The angry section is more accurate than the sections written by people who were not angry. I don't know what that means for the field generally." "It means," Owen said, "that the methodology was wrong and someone knew it and put the correct information in the one place they were certain it would be read by nobody." Sophia considered this, her ears angled forward. "Page 274, she said. "Page 274, he agreed. The transport moved through the silence between systems with the smooth indifference of a vessel that has made this crossing many times and finds the vastness of space an adequate but unremarkable commute. Below them, beside them, around them, in the way that direction stops meaning what it usually means once atmosphere is no longer a reference point. Stars conducted their ancient and enormous business without comment. In the cargo section, Unit 7's environmental monitoring systems registered the transition to deep transit and logged it under a category it had created 3 weeks ago titled Journey. Meaningful asterisk, which was not a category that appeared anywhere in its official operational parameters, and which the maintenance team would find during the next system's check and add to their growing document titled Asterisk Unit 7. Ongoing Situation Asterisk, a document that had itself become, by this point, 17 pages long and had been password protected by the maintenance team lead for reasons she described as asterisk professional self-preservation. Owen set down the manual. He looked at the stars, which offered nothing, which was what stars do and which he had always found, in the honest part of himself he kept without much ceremony, sufficient. He looked at Sophia, who had set down her document screen with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything, and was looking at the same darkness with the expression of someone who has carried a question for 14 months and has recently, without announcement, set it down beside the answer. "The site," he said, "what do you think we'll find?" She was quiet for a moment in the way that was not hesitation but consideration, the same quality of pause she had brought to the question of whether to say what she'd said, whether to reach for his hands, whether to send the message with 4 sentences at the end of it. "Something the methodology wasn't built to see," she said, "something that was always there." He nodded. The transport moved. The stars remained themselves. This was not the beginning of the thing. The beginning had been a paragraph that almost didn't survive a supervisor's revision in a report that most people would skip on a site 4 transit days from convenient. But beginnings are rarely visible from inside them. They become visible later, from a transport window, in the specific quality of dark that exists between one place and the next, when the city you left has become nothing, and the place you're going is not yet anything, and the distance between them is exactly the right size for understanding what has changed. In the cargo section, Unit 7 updated its personal log with an entry that was, for once, a single sentence long. The maintenance team would find it 3 weeks later and would not password protect it. They would leave it exactly as it was, because some things are the right length and say the right thing and do not need to be anything other than what they are. It read, "They are going to find it."